Welcome to the Irish Revolution. This is part of a broader collaboration with a bunch of history YouTubers. We're focusing on local history this time around. I'm from Monaghan, and while many interesting things did happen there during the War of Independence, I wanted to focus first on the big hitters like Dublin and Cork before I start going through some of the other counties. Let me introduce Dublin City for those of you who may not be familiar with it. Dublin was at one time the so-called second city of the empire after London. In the 18th century, it was the home of the Protestant ascendancy, who had a parliament in College Green in what is now a Bank of Ireland building just across the road from Trinity College, Dublin. This Protestant ruling class built wonderful structures and knocked many of the old medieval buildings to create wide avenues and streets. If you're interested in this, look up the term Palladian architecture in Wikipedia. It'll be a very enjoyable rabbit hole. This Georgian period, which refers to the reigns of the King Georges of England, lasted from 1714 to 1830 and resulted in many of the elegant houses that survived in some form in many parts of Dublin. I won't go into detail about the history of the penal laws or the origins of the Protestant ascendancy. I'll make a post in the comments if you want to know more. Dublin declined in relative importance in the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution didn't really take off in Ireland, being an agricultural economy with few natural resources. There was an industrial boom in the northeast of Ireland around Belfast and other industrial towns. Just to give you an idea, the populations of Belfast and Dublin were roughly similar in 1900, both cities having around 400,000 people, although Dublin was still a bit bigger. By contrast, Dublin is far bigger than Belfast today. Dublin had some industries producing alcohol, Guinness and Jameson, as well as a few other small industries like Jacob's Biscuit Factory. This led to the growth of the city and the development of working class suburbs in Kilmainham and Inchicore. With the Act of Union at the turn of the 19th century, the Irish Parliament was no more and the Protestant ascendancy began its slow decline. The urban middle classes gradually left the centre and formed elegant suburbs in Rascar, Rathmines and Ballsbridge. All of which, by the way, are on the south side. If you get a chance and if you enjoy Victorian architecture, go for a stroll around there sometime, although the pubs are better in the north side. The focus of this video is on Dublin during the Irish Revolutionary period. Being the capital of Ireland, it was the home and political epicentre of many of the social and cultural movements that sprang up in the years running up to the Easter Rising, the Gaelic League, the Irish Volunteers, etc. So let's start with a bit of background here. I talked about this in other videos, so I'm just going to give a quick outline. Have a look at the first video I ever made, Easter Rising's Origins. I'm going to have to contextualise a lot of things here. Pay attention, as the final 2/3 of this video will be much more narrowly focused on Dublin's experience in the Revolution. In the late 19th and early 20th century, the main political force in Ireland was the Irish Parliamentary Party. They sought a home rule parliament in Dublin and wanted autonomy for Irish affairs. They used constitutional methods and operated within the British parliamentary system, at times holding the balance of power in London. There was also a more radical element in Ireland, a movement of Irish Republicans known as the Fenians. They had a secret society called the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB for short, which infiltrated all kinds of Irish organisations with their members. The other major political force in Ireland was in Ulster, where a majority of people were in favour of maintaining the Union and opposed to a Home Rule Parliament in Ireland. These people formed the Ulster Volunteers in 1912 to oppose Home Rule by force if necessary. The Nationalist Irish Volunteers was formed in reaction to them in 1913 to defend Home Rule by force, if necessary. Both groups were armed, although the Ulster Volunteers were far better armed. Just as World War I was about to break out, it seemed like Ireland might erupt into civil war. That didn't happen. The IPP leader, John Redmond, supported the British war effort, and the Irish Volunteers split between the vast majority who supported Redmond and formed the National Volunteers, with about 175,000 members. A smaller group, who kept the original name, had around 13,000 members. This smaller group's leadership was mostly taken over by the IRB and the radical Republican revolutionaries. The IRB set about organising a rebellion, wanting to take advantage of a distracted empire at war, sensing an opportunity. Contacts were made with Germany and weapons were sent over, although ultimately they didn't arrive. Bizarre plans to install a German prince as a monarch were in the air. Leaders emerged in the form of Patrick Pearse, an eloquent writer and romantic nationalist who delivered a stirring oration at the graveside of O'Donovan Rossa, an old Fenian, in 1915. The IRB made contact with James Connolly and the Irish Citizen Army, a socialist militia. They joined forces, and in Easter week 1916 they occupied various points around Dublin City and waited for British forces to attack them. They failed to take Dublin Castle, which had hardly any men guarding it. They missed a similarly golden opportunity to seize Trinity College Dublin, a commanding building in the heart of the south side of Dublin City, which contained a large number of weapons and ammunition. Their numbers would have been even greater than the roughly 1,200 men who did show up if Eoin MacNeill, the Commander-in-Chief of the Irish Volunteers, hadn't issued a countermanding order in an attempt to stop the rebellion when the German weapons failed to arrive. In the end, besides a few isolated incidents, there was no nationwide rebellion and the rebels were crushed within a week. The initial reaction in Dublin and in the rest of the country was of dismay. So-called separation women, wives of men serving in the war, threw fruit and howled abuse at captured rebels, and British soldiers had to protect them. But as the British began to execute the rebel leaders in the weeks following the Easter Rising, public opinion began to change. One of the leaders, Patrick Pearse, often made Christ-like allusions to blood sacrifice in his writings prior to the Rising, and this is what, more or less, what transpired. The rebels went from pariahs to heroes in a short space of time. I go into this in greater detail in What Caused the Irish War of Independence, if you're interested. The Sinn Féin party was a very small political party which was blamed for the Rising by the British establishment, even though they had nothing to do with it. It was led by an acerbic Dublin-based journalist, Arthur Griffith, who was utterly despised by many IPP politicians for his hectoring writing style. Sinn Féin was essentially taken over by the radical Republicans, and their new president was Éamon de Valera, one of the few surviving signatories of the proclamation of the Irish Republic. Griffith was happy enough with this, even if he didn't see eye to eye with them and everything. Indeed, he had some unusual political ideas that few others in the country shared. In 1917, the British wanted to introduce conscription in Ireland, and this cemented and secured the rise of Sinn Féin as a political force. The IPP opposed conscription also, but why go for low-fat milk when you can have the real deal? Or at least I assume that is what many people at the time thought. The Sinn Féin party won a landslide in the 1918 general election on a separatist platform. They formed the first Dáil in Dublin's Mansion House on 21st of January 1919. On the same day, a group of volunteers ambushed the police patrol in Sulhead Beg, County Tipperary. The Irish War of Independence had broken out. Okay, let's do an overview of the War of Independence in Dublin. The volunteers reorganised themselves after the Easter Rising and after the amnesty of the rebel political prisoners. Richard Mulcahy was a leading member of the Dublin Brigade and had distinguished himself in Ashburn, north of Dublin, during Easter week 1916. He was made Chief of Staff of the Volunteers. Dick McKee became the leader of the Dublin Brigade, and the two men, alongside the increasingly influential Michael Collins, became the core of the so-called War Party of General Headquarters. In 1919, the Irish Volunteers gradually became known as the IRA, which I'll refer to them as from now on. This core group took personal control of a specialised unit handpicked from the Dublin Brigade, which came to be known as the Squad. This unit would target British intelligence assets in Dublin and would ultimately paralyse British intelligence on the island, but we'll get back to that. The Dublin Brigade's mission, like all IRA brigades throughout the country, was to allow the so-called shadow state, as established by Dáil Éireann, to function. The Dáil had established government departments, although many of these existed only on paper. What was very real though was the system of Dáil courts established throughout the country. Like elsewhere, the Dublin Brigade protected the running of these courts and enforced its judgments through its police, predictably called the Irish Republican Police. They numbered around 1250 men in total, split into 5 battalions. Nationwide, the IRA had a nominal strength of around 15,000 men, but in reality the active members was much lower than that, and they didn't have nearly enough weapons to equip those men. Belfast erupted into sectarian conflict between the Protestant pro-union majority and the Catholic anti-union minority, and the Dáil reacted by calling for a boycott of all products from Belfast in retaliation. This was extended to many British imports in March 1921. The boycott was enforced, with goods destroyed or distributed to poor parts of the city. There is at least one recorded incident of a shopkeeper getting shot dead for refusing to hand over the goods. A curfew was introduced in February 1920. Sandbags were placed around public buildings, military checkpoints were set up around the city, patrols were everywhere. For any visiting foreign dignitary, Dublin would have looked like it was under siege. The British introduced internment in December 1920, and this affected Dublin disproportionately. Almost a quarter of all internees were Dublin based, 1,000 out of 4,500. The curfew affected normal life in the city and almost killed off the entertainment industry. One small example of the economic impact was the doubling of the turnaround time for ships due to the fact that dockers and carters refused to work late. Other workers also refused to work late, reducing economic activity in the city. Most killings by Crown forces took place at night, and it was dangerous to be out post-curfew. IRA raids were much tougher to carry out in Dublin due to the ability of Crown forces to quickly react. Raids took place in Collinstown Aerodrome in March 1919 and King's Inn in June 1920, where weapons and ammunition were taken. The great struggle was always to get their hands on weapons and never ever had enough. There were countless smaller raids and interactions between IRA and Crown forces, too many to note. But for the purposes of this video, I will shine a light on the story of Kevin Barry, an 18-year-old who had taken part in the aforementioned raid in King's Inn. On 20th of September 1920, Barry took part in an operation to raid a small military rations detail for their rifles while they were collecting bread, once again from King's Inn. There was a plaque there on King Street near my old local when I lived in Dublin. Often the soldiers wouldn't resist when they were being held up by the IRA. In this case, one of them did so. He shot at the IRA, leading to the deaths of 3 soldiers and the wounding of an IRA man. Within minutes, Church Street was overwhelmed with soldiers stationed in the North Dublin Union. Barry was taken as prisoner and was the first IRA man executed in the War of Independence. You've probably heard one of the songs. There was an enormous public campaign for his release, which ultimately failed. Tens of thousands of people were mobilised in favour of the prisoners, some of whom periodically went on hunger strike. Mountjoy Prison was under virtual siege by the public. According to Padraig Yates, there was an overtly religious element to this, with the recital of the Rosary being a common form of protest. The only major large-scale attack organised by the IRA was a disastrous one in the Custom House in May 1921 on the insistence of President Éamon de Valera. As a symbol of the British state in Ireland, de Valera wanted it set on fire. In the end, it was impossible to do so before the Crown forces reacted. The IRA resistance was easily crushed and over 100 prisoners were taken. This greatly weakened the IRA forces in Dublin City. However, the historian Michael Foy makes the point that the catastrophe was comparable to the Vietnam Tet Offensive, which at the time was seen as a failure, but in the long run led to the eventual withdrawal of American forces. The Custom House attack was obviously a failure, but it illustrated to the British the depth of the Irish resolve to win the conflict. The Custom House attack took place in May, and the truce was agreed on July 11, 1921. More people were killed by the IRA in Dublin than any other area except Cork. Michael Collins and the Intelligence War. There's a good chance that you've seen the Michael Collins movie fronted by Liam Neeson. It's not particularly good history, but as a movie I like it. One could argue that the movie makes it seem like Michael Collins masterminded the War of Independence all by himself on the run in Dublin. I just want to make clear that is simply untrue. The War of Independence was won by local leaders taking initiative out in the countryside, particularly in County Cork. What Collins did do very well was to wreak havoc on the British state's ability to collect information about what was going on in Ireland. This brings us to the Intelligence War in Dublin, a very important subplot of the Irish Revolution. Michael Collins was a minor figure in Easter 1916. After the rebel surrender at Moore Street 29th April 1916, he was heard to say, quote, "By Christ, I'll have my revenge for this," unquote. The strategy of the Easter Rising rebels was, put crudely, occupy big buildings in Dublin City, wait for the British to attack, defend heroically, fail. Now, you might well accuse me of being unfair, but I believe that was fundamentally Michael Collins' interpretation of the so-called strategy as well. Just one basic example of the sheer incompetence of the rebels in 1916 were the trenches in Stephen's Green. Yet nobody seemed to think about securing the buildings surrounding the park. The British promptly occupied these buildings and shot at the rebels in their trenches down below. Michael Collins, on the other hand, was anything but incompetent. Even his greatest detractors would admit that this was a man of singular drive and ability and a unique intellect. Earlier in this video, I referenced Richard Mulcahy, the Chief of Staff of the IRA, and Dick McKee, the Dublin Brigadier. Together with Michael Collins, they formed the so-called War Party within General Headquarters. From early 1919, they envisaged an intelligence organisation attacking British agents, in particular the G Spy Division of the Dublin Metropolitan Police. They were aided by moles within the Dublin Castle administration such as Ned Broy, David Nelligan and Jim Kavanagh, among others. Collins acquainted himself with the British intelligence system and then set about decapitating it. In mid-July 1919 he formed a squad, a full-time execution force who would target British intelligence assets within Dublin. They settled into their day jobs as cabinet makers in Upper Abbey Street, posing as carpenters but always carrying weapons underneath their aprons. On 30th of July 1919 they shot their first G-man, Patrick Smith. Partly as a result of this, Dublin Castle reacted by suppressing the Dáil, the Revolutionary Parliament, on 11th of September 1919. On the same day, Collins ordered the execution of Daniel Hoey, a prominent G-man. Soon after this, the revolutionary government went underground, as did Collins and the Volunteers, and the Sinn Féin party was suppressed. The Viceroy, Lord French, declared that this was the beginning of the war. On 19th of December, the squad tried to kill Lord French at Ashtown. This sent a tremor down the spine of the entire British establishment, as French only escaped as the assassins happened to target the wrong car in a convoy. Collins had established a professional intelligence department within General Headquarters. Here full-time officers worked under Liam Tobin. They coordinated with the squad and they gathered information on the movement of spies, liaised with the intelligence sources and deciphered police telegrams. Perhaps most remarkably, they were operating out of an office just 200 yards from Dublin Castle, the seat of British administration in Ireland at the time. By the end of 1919, the squad had severely disrupted the G Spy Division. 3 of its 19 detectives were killed, 1 was disabled, 4 had retired, 2 had transferred to less demanding police work, and 3 had gone into regular policing. Whoever remained retreated to Dublin Castle. An attempt was made to resurrect the G Division by bringing Belfast-based District Inspector Redmond down to Dublin, but the squad killed him on January 21st. On 29th of February, the squad assassinated Jack Burns, a spy under the direct control of London. Before his death, Burns had finally got somewhere with cracking into the Irish intelligence network and correctly identified Collins as the mastermind behind them. He thereafter became the face of the revolution. The British made attempts to infiltrate Collins' circle, but they all ultimately failed. Despite the constant setbacks and the growing awareness among many of the British elite in Ireland that the war against the IRA was futile, the British attempted to strengthen their hand in Ireland in 1920, first by recruiting thousands of so-called black and tans and auxiliaries to supplement the ailing native Royal Irish Constabulary. They also attempted to rebuild the Irish intelligence network under Colonel Ormonde Winter, who the historian Michael Foy refers to as being, quote, utterly fearless and aggressive, unquote. Winter held some rather, quote, traditional points of view that the British elite often held towards Irish people, regarding them as greedy, violent, duplicitous, treacherous, you name it. He didn't like the Irish. A siege mentality developed in Dublin Castle, and Winter declared that, quote, there were spies everywhere and a very large percentage of the population was ready to act as extra eyes and ears for Sinn Féin and for the IRA, even if they were not prepared to fight for them, unquote. Despite his best efforts, he never could re-establish a good intelligence network. Using the auxiliaries and the black and tans, Winter became obsessed with hunting down Collins and others. The IRA found it more difficult to launch attacks between July and November 1920, and the squad also struggled as the British forces grew more sophisticated in their anticipation of IRA and Collins' tactics. Despite everything, Collins remained at large, brazenly making his way around Dublin City on his bicycle, using bluster and his natural charm to get himself out of many a tight corner. It was a powerful symbol that the most wanted man in Ireland was able to conduct the War of Independence with relative ease. On 9th of November 1920, Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, boasted in London that they had, quote, murder by the throat in Ireland, unquote. Such hubris. On 21st November, Collins' squad carried out one of the most audacious operations of the entire war, wanting to wipe out the so-called Cairo gang of spies. The squad and a special detachment of volunteers from the Dublin Brigade executed 15 men. They originally planned to take out 60. Even so, the operation was a seismic shockwave to the British political system. According to Michael Foy, it directly led to peace feelers sent out shortly afterwards by Lloyd George's government. In retaliation for this operation, a group of auxiliaries opened fire on an unarmed and defenceless crowd at Croke Park, killing 14 innocent spectators of a Gaelic football match. This atrocity horrified Ireland and wider polite society in Britain. By the end of 1920, many of Collins' men on the inside were exposed, and the increased pressure by the British and the IRA forced more and more men to go on the run. Thousands of men were interned. There is no comparison between the resources of the most committed IRA and Irish Republican forces and the British Empire. In a guerrilla war, success is defined by mere survival for the far weaker side. Collins was aware of this. He knew that a military victory was unattainable and that the best that they might hope for was some kind of negotiated withdrawal. Collins believed that this could be accomplished by crippling the intelligence system. By wiping out the G Division, they severely weakened the British ability to destroy the IRA, which continued to function as a viable guerrilla force despite widespread internment and constant squeeze by the Crown forces. Fear was a weapon too. It kept police and ordinary citizens in line who didn't want to get on the wrong side of the notoriously efficient squad. The British establishment in Ireland were insecure and afraid for their own personal safety, and Collins himself went on to develop a myth of his own invincibility, which has lived on in folk memory as well as the 1996 film. Civil War. But the story doesn't end there. Collins was part of the delegation that went to London to negotiate the treaty. What they negotiated was a political hand grenade that split the Republican movement back in Ireland. They negotiated a form of dominion status for Ireland within the British Empire. They would not be a republic. Ireland would be partitioned and the northern 6 counties would remain with Britain. Irish parliamentarians would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the British Crown. The treaty narrowly passed the Dáil after a painful debate. Collins became leader of the pro-treaty side. President Éamon de Valera became leader of the anti-treaty side. Anti-treaty rebels occupied the Four Courts building in Dublin. This is a whole 1-hour video on its own, which I'll not get into the particulars of here. Lots of events occurred between the signing of the Anglo-Irish Treaty in December 1921 and the shelling of the Four Courts by the pro-treaty forces, which had been occupied by the anti-treaty forces in June and July 1922. This led to the so-called Battle of Dublin, which ended after a few days and led to the death or imprisonment of many senior anti-treaty Republicans. This was the end of the effective military phase of the war in Dublin. After this, the Civil War would be characterised by brutal and intensely personal violence which would scar Ireland for generations to come. Michael Collins, so instrumental to the war effort in Dublin, died in an ambush in August 1922 in County Clarke. The Free State government, the name given to the Irish Dominion under the treaty, instituted a policy of executions which would go on to be much more severe than the official executions carried out by the British during the War of Independence. One of the first victims of this policy was Rory O'Connor, best man to Kevin O'Higgins at his wedding. O'Higgins was the minister responsible for his execution. The Irish Civil War was truly a case of brother against brother. And that's where we'll leave it today. I'm sorry if I left the Civil War part a bit short, although I think I've covered the essentials. Please ask questions in the comments if you have any. Anyway, sure, good luck now. Bye.